It's May of 878, and two shield walls face each other near a place called Edington. Alfred, the embattled but determined King of Wessex, rouses the spirits of his levies as they inch ever closer to their heathen foes. On this day, during the darkest time of King Alfred's kingdom, the destiny of England would truly be decided. During April of 871, the weight of the world dragged heavily on the young shoulders of Alfred, the last son of Æthelwulf and great scion of Egbert, King of Wessex. He had succeeded his brother Æthelred as king, having fought ferociously alongside him several bruising battles over the previous months. At Ashdown, Alfred was key to his brother's victory, holding out against both contingents of the Danish horde long enough for Æthelred to close in on Halfdan. For his heroic, if ferocious actions that day, the young Atheling had earned his nickname, the Wild Boar of Ashdown. Now he would have to maintain that title if he and his kingdom could ever hope to survive. Alfred's struggle began almost immediately, even as he was attending to his brother's funeral at Wimborne, and likely his own coronation there. In May, Alfred presided over another defeat at Wilton, his forces having been bested before without him. Despite his and his brother's great success at Ashdown, this was one of the greatest string of defeats suffered by the West Saxons, and now Wilton smashed any immediate hopes of driving the heathens from his lands, at least by force of arms alone. With the rest of the summer and even the prospect of Halfdan's host fighting long into the months after ahead of him, Alfred sent word to Reading that he would offer payment for peace. This was a gamble, considering the Danes hardly kept their word on every past occasion, yet this agreement held, though such a decision may have grated against the thanes and bishops who the king would have to rely on to raise such a likely huge sum. Halfdan withdrew to Mercia in London, which may strike us today as remarkable, given he had had the lion's share of victories against the West Saxons. Likely not only was Alfred's payment sufficiently huge, but the Wessex feared's resistance damaging enough to concentrate Danish minds. In contrast to Wessex, Mercia, when Nottingham had been attacked, called on West Saxon aid, yet when Wessex bled, the Mercians hadn't rallied, and yet the southern kingdom had fought them to a bloody standstill. Burgred's Mercia, then, had proven a far surer path of least resistance, a kingdom far weaker in terms of its dynasty's hold on power and its military strength. Wintering in London in 872, Halfdan moved north to suppress a Northumbrian revolt before venturing back into Mercian territory. Burgred proved he had no appetite to take on Halfdan's warriors, and at Torksey agreed another hefty payment that was likely becoming increasingly difficult to make. But, unlike Alfred, Burgred's luck had run out. The Viking hosts did indeed strike camp as agreed, but not south into Wessex or into East Anglia. Instead, they headed for Repton in Derbyshire. The occupation of Repton was a sore blow to Burgred's pride, as the burial site of several former Mercian kings, and a centre of power for another royal dynasty. The signal, though, was loud and clear. The Danes had thrown their weight behind a rival claimant to Burgred's throne. Fearing for his life, Burgred fled the kingdom, eventually reaching Rome, where he would die ignominiously some years later. Meanwhile, the Danes set up Æthelwulf as their puppet. Following the subjugation of Mercia, Halfdan moved north with a band that split off, raiding into Scotland during 875, before returning south in 876, dividing the spoils. The second half of the army being quietly observed by Alfred's scouts at Repton, and under the leadership of Guthrum, Anwend and Ossital, decided on a new campaign. They moved to Cambridge and bided their time there. At some point during this time, power was concentrated into Guthrum's hands, with Anwend and Ossital disappearing from accounts, though it's not unlikely that they simply saw Viking East Anglia or Northumbria enticing enough prospects for land and power without battle against the hard-nosed West Saxons. Guthrum clearly begged to differ. In late 875, Guthrum struck a lightning march into Wessex, cutting a swathe right through the centre, an action that Alfred was either too slow or unable to contest. His target was the coastal settlement of Wareham, which he took with little trouble. King Alfred could only shadow his advance, and found Guthrum's men firmly dug in there. Initially, Guthrum's move seemed daft. He had carved his way into the heartland of Wessex, his supply lines to East Anglia and Viking Mercia cut off by Alfred's blockade. If Alfred couldn't break into Wareham, then Guthrum sure as hell couldn't break out. Yet the appearance of an impasse was soon shattered as West Saxon scouts gave Alfred news that a Viking fleet prowled the seas near Poole. Still confident in his assessment of the situation as an impasse, Alfred proposed another cessation of hostilities in return for another hefty payment, of course. Yet, in an unusual move that perhaps demonstrated Alfred's growing knowledge of his enemy, he demanded oaths from Guthrum, sworn not on Christian terms, but to their own gods. Yet, if Alfred was assured that Guthrum's swearing on an arm ring would restrain the bloodlust of his men, he must have been sorely disappointed. Instead of marching back to East Anglia or Mercia, the Danes struck camp at night and stole away to Exeter. Now the Viking lord had an even better position with which to disembark his warriors from his waiting fleet. This seemed to be it, the moment the two hordes would emerge to crush Alfred, transforming the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom into Daneland. Yet fate, it seems, intervened, as even the tightest plans can be undone by the weather, and so it proved. As the Viking fleet closed in off of the Dorset coast, a storm blew in, smashing it to oblivion, or as the 12th century chronicler Geoffrey Gamer puts it, quote, 140 of their ships went to the devil. Whether an act of God, as Alfred almost certainly believed, or sheer dumb luck, the result was the same. Now Guthrum sweated uneasily in Exeter, his reinforcement, means of escape, rotting at the bottom of the sea. Alfred compounded the disaster by dutifully marching on Exeter, hemming the Viking lord in. This time, the West Saxons held the whip hand, Alfred being assured that the terms of the new treaty would be kept. Alfred took many more hostages, and likely specifically those of his own choosing, presumably less expendable than those given at Wareham, who no doubt shared the same grim fate as the Saxon hostages who had had their throats slit for Guthrum's march to Exeter. In August of 877, Guthrum marched north to Gloucester in Mercia. At this time, an agreement was made to carve up the Middle Kingdom, with Gloucester in the east going to the Vikings, and the west remaining under Æthelwulf. It appeared the Vikings were finally ready to stand down and settle, a lesser evil to conquest and away from Alfred's kingdom. Unfortunately, this was not to be. Alfred, perhaps in great spirits, having cornered and humiliated his Danish foe, whilst at the same time receiving news that Halfdan, his earlier opponent at Ashdown, had died in the north during a skirmish, moved himself and his court to the royal estate at Chippenham during the 12-day festival of Christmas. Peace once more had come at a price, yet this word maybe had an ambiguity lost on Alfred. Though Saxon gold brought temporary respite, it also increased the burden on his richer subjects, those aldermen, bishops and thanes who actually had the responsibility coughing up the treasure or land. Alfred may have allowed himself some peace, and even mirth, given the time of the year too was also a time of celebration for the Danes, and so his guard may have been down. Yet across in Gloucester, Guthrum was not merry, and was planning a new strike that would hopefully decapitate the West Saxon kingdom in one swift blow. On Monday 6th of January of 878, Alfred, along with his witan, were gathered together, the king distributing gifts among his followers. Yet little did he know that Guthrum's men were already prowling silently across the frozen fields of Wiltshire, closing in. Guthrum's horde struck hard and brutally, killing those who had not fled, though crucially Alfred himself and a small band of followers did manage to slip out before the blow finally struck. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle matter-of-factly describes no battle at the gates or last stand of any troops, but simply Alfred's almost lone escape, which opens up the intriguing possibility that something else had happened that night, perhaps a coup. The witan or council of important men did elect kings, could also unelect them, especially a sickly king who had lost more battles than he had won, and increasingly bought off rather than fought with the Danish menace, costing the church and the great men dearly. Whether or not treachery in the West Saxon court was afoot, the result was the same, with Alfred fleeing. With no army mustered to oppose him, and the king fleeing for his life, Guthrum had free reign in Wessex, and may have made accords with some of the nobles there. Guthrum may even have fondly hoped that now he was decisively defeated, Alfred would follow Burgred's example and retire with a sizable treasure abroad, perhaps to Francia or further afield to Rome, to live out the rest of his days in comfortable exile. If Guthrum had hoped this, then he was dead wrong. The king did have one huge advantage over his Danish enemy. He was King of Wessex, and he knew his land better than any foreigner. Withdrawing into the marshy territory west in Somerset, though Alfred, like any normal man, may have been forgiven if he had given up in despair, instead he marshalled his small gathering to build a fort at Athelney, an island easily defensible and with links to the rest of the kingdom. From Athelney, the king led sorties against isolated Danish patrols, no doubt hunting him, looking to snuff out the last free king. During this time, Alfred likely sent his own messages throughout Wessex, gathering more of the feared from neighbouring shires, probably Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire. It was also during this lowest ebb for Alfred that the legend of the burning of the cakes originates. Sadly, very often the only factoid people remember about this extraordinary man. The basic story has it that the king was so consumed in his despair and thoughts that whilst staying in the home of a peasant woman, he allowed some cakes to burn before him, provoking the woman's scolding, which he humbly endured. Yet, if the incident did happen, and if it marked the king's lowest point, news would have soon reached Alfred that lifted both his and his people's hopes. Another Viking fleet had arrived, under the son of Ragnar, Ubba, this time there being no wrath of Mother Nature and thus allowing a landing at Devon. However, Ubba was confronted by the loyal alderman Odda, and the Devon feared. Having fortified themselves on some high ground, Odda and his men burst out in a sudden sortie. The chronicle crows, quote, "And the same winter the brother of Hingwa and Halfdin came with 23 ships to Devonshire and Wessex, and he was there slain, and with him 840 men of his army, and there was taken the war flag, which they called the Raven." The slaying of Ubba, the last son of Ragnar, and the capturing of the Raven banner must have chilled the hearts of Guthrum and his host, while invigorating Alfred's. It was definitely a reversal, and may have done much to boost the confidence of the normal man to rally to their king later on. As winter melted into spring, hopes were justifiably high, as Alfred later made his way to King Egbert's Stone, on the boundary of Wiltshire and Somerset, and east of Selwood. If treachery had beset Alfred that dark night in Chippenham, then the gathered fear that met him there inflamed his spirits, and sight of him, if Asa, Alfred's biographer, is to be believed, similarly cheered them. Asa writes, quote, "When they saw the king, receiving him not surprisingly, as if one restored to life, after suffering such great tribulations, they were filled with immense joy. The army that marched in high spirits from the Stone was perhaps around 4,000 strong, composed of the toughened levies of Wiltshire, Hampshire and Somerset. News filtered into Chippenham of its approach, prompting Guthrum to move to confront and smash this West Saxon force. Guthrum chose to place his smaller force at Bratton, near to the village of Edington, the site of an old Iron Age hill fort, suitable high ground. Meeting the gaze of the first of the feared to surmount the chalky ridge was the dense shield wall of the waiting Danes. For such an important battle in the history of England, and thus arguably of world history, Alfred's usually unabashed biographer Asa is somewhat stingy in details on the actual fighting, writing, quote, "Alfred moved his forces and came to a place called Edington, and fighting fiercely with a compact shield wall against the entire Viking army, he persevered resolutely for a long time. At length he gained the victory through God's will." The fighting then was long and hard, two tightly knit shield walls hacking away at each other, the scrum of sword, shield and muscle shifting to and fro, until, finally, chinks began to crack in Guthrum's line, and the momentum decidedly shifted into Alfred's favour. With his force fast fragmenting, Guthrum himself later in the day must have decided to call a general retreat. Asa gleefully writing, quote, "Alfred destroyed the Vikings with great slaughter, pursued those who fled as far as the stronghold, hacking them down." Guthrum's destination was back to Chippenham, the place that had begun Alfred's spiral into his dark internal exile, but which now ended full circle with his absolute triumph. Having cornered the Danes in Chippenham, their food supply quickly ran out, the Danes likely not considering they would need to provision for a siege. Before Edington, Alfred had negotiated, always arguably on the back foot. Now he could dictate these terms. To this end he waited patiently for 2 weeks. Asa writes, quote, "The Vikings, thoroughly terrified by hunger, cold and fear, and in the end by despair, sought peace on this condition. The king should take as many hostages as he wanted from them, and give none to them. Never indeed had they made peace with anyone on such terms." With little choice other than slaughter or starvation, Guthrum agreed. Leaving Chippenham and heading to Cirencester, Guthrum's damaged host remained there for around a year, as details of a new treaty were worked out. Edington was no doubt acknowledged even at the time as an important turning point. The subsequent Treaty of Wedmore provided Guthrum with another way to retain some power as the king of an independent East Anglia, though, as a Christian, the terms dictated that Guthrum convert along with his leading men, with Alfred sponsoring him as his godfather, a spiritual and symbolic gesture designed to solidify the new political reality. The subsequent Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum divided up Mercia between Danish and West Saxon spheres, an arrangement that would endure. Guthrum would rule East Anglia as Æthelstan, this arrangement granting Alfred and Wessex a crucial relative peace in the years to come, though other Viking incursions would have to be faced, and the war for the making of England was far from over.